It is a great honor for me to be here. I think the prayer breakfast that you have in Jerusalem, the prayer breakfast you have in Washington, is an important political institution as well as a spiritual venue. I feel not just honored to be here, but I'm glad to be able to talk about the security challenges facing not just the United States, not just Ukraine, not just Israel, but the democratic world which the United States helped to build after the horrors of World War II. And I have a special affection for being here because I served both at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv during what I call the Second Gulf War, the Saddam Hussein Gulf War in the early 90s. And then I served at the U.S. Consulate in Jerusalem in the late 90s, where I had the distinction, if you want to call it that, of being the least important member of the American delegation at the Camp David Summit, the second Camp David Summit, which of course was a failure, sadly. Okay, we face, and again, we, I mean the democratic world, certainly the greatest national security danger since the end of the Cold War, and you could even argue since perhaps the end of World War II. There are four countries militarily powerful, although one far less militarily powerful than the other three, and I'll come to that in a minute, working hard against the interests, first and foremost, of the United States, but also our key allies and partners, and that really today means most importantly Israel and Ukraine. And of course, those four countries are China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Now, in Marxist parlance, which still is very, very common in Russia and of course in China and North Korea, there's a phrase of like, who's your principal adversary, your principal foe? And guess what? All four of those countries consider the United States to be their principal adversary. Now, Iran, working in the Middle East, doesn't use that sort of Marxist language, so they call us, the United States, the great Satan. But of course, they have nearby the little Satan, meaning Israel. And that's one very quick way to capture the national security danger in the Middle East. A former senior official in the Bush administration, Philip Zelikow, wrote an absolutely brilliant article in the Texas National Security Review last summer, in which he said, among other things, the cooperation of these four countries, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, is greater today than the cooperation amongst the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Japan, and Fascist Italy, prior to Pearl Harbor. That's an important observation which has not been fully grasped by policymakers in this town and elsewhere. Now, we've seen very clear examples of their cooperation at the two knife points where the group of four are on the offensive, in Israel and in Ukraine. It's notable, talking about the Middle East, that Hamas showed up in Moscow right after October 7th. We know that without the support that Russia has provided to Iran, and without, obviously, Iran's resources, there would have been no Hamas offensive on October 7th. We know without Iranian resources and cooperation with Russia, which helped Iran develop its missiles and other weapon systems, the Houthis would have not been able both to attack Israel and international shipping. And of course, we know on the flip side of that, Moscow, which has not had a very easy time in Ukraine since its big invasion, has relied on Iranian drones and missiles to pound Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. So we've seen the activity there. And of course, we know that, again, Moscow, whose vast military resources were not sufficient to maintain their barbaric campaign against Ukrainian cities and civilians, would have not gotten as far as it has gotten or created as much damage as it has created without North Korean missiles. And of course, as we've seen over the past several months, without North Korean troops. And without Chinese dual technology and economic support, the Russian economy, which is in bad shape, would be in far worse shape. So these guys are all working together against most immediately Ukraine and Israel, but ultimately against us, the United States. And again, this concept has not been fully grasped. The Biden administration provided substantial support to Ukraine, but never enough support to really kick the Russians out of much of Ukrainian territory. The Trump administration wants to achieve not a just peace, a durable peace in Ukraine, which is good enough for government work, although not ideal, but has not pursued that in the energetic and well-informed manner of putting the pressure on the guy who doesn't want that peace. And also, for reasons I don't understand, the Trump administration has decided it no longer has a bone of contention with the Houthis as they continue to slam Israel. That's a problem too. Bottom line. We face, again, an enormous challenge. These four countries are working together. You can be sure if the United States does not stand up to the challenge, that the bad guys can win. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but there are people of influence in this town who don't understand the stakes, whether it's in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe, and they don't understand, and there's at least one high official who's made his misunderstanding very prominent, that were this to happen, the chances of the Chinese moving on Taiwan go up through the ceiling. Which is why, by the way, when this talk came, that the United States only had resources to deal with the Western Pacific, with East Asia, and that forget Ukraine, and in fact, that same official said forget Israel too, although not in such a loud voice. The leaders of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan all said publicly the best way to deter Chinese aggression is to defeat Putin in Ukraine. Basic geopolitical sense. But that also applies to Israel. When they made that statement, it wasn't clear that there might be some wobbling in the United States as Iran went after Israel. But you notice I said earlier that 3 of these 4 countries were militarily powerful, 1 less so. The 1 less so, of course, is Iran, because of the extraordinary military operations, both brilliant and powerful, that the Israeli government took against Iran, against the advice of the previous administration. With that, I think I've outlined the problem. The answer is clear. Our other speakers spoke to this answer. The United States remains, despite all of its problems, the most powerful nation in the world. We have the resources to deal with the threats in the Western Pacific, in the Middle East, and in Eastern Europe. Now, we can't do that stupidly, the way we conducted the war on terror after 9/11, but we can do it smart. And the best way to do it smart is when you have competent, determined allies and friends. And we've witnessed Ukrainian determination over the past 3 years since the big Russian invasion. In fact, the past 11 years, when Moscow's war in Ukraine began. And we've witnessed Israeli determination, since 1947? With that, I think I've spoken enough. Thank you very much for the opportunity.